All right. I can't remember if I did a classic album of the week or if I had already done this one, but in case I didn't, the last one would be Toulouse Street by the Doobie Brothers. This one has an old album, and it's got, listen to the music. I believe it's from 1972, so you might want to take a look at this one. Let me see if it says on here. It does not. But anyway, if you look up Toulouse Street, you must have heard the song, listened to the music, you must have heard of the Doobie Brothers. So anyway, it's a classic album. It cost me $2.84 when I bought it brand new. And so just to give you an idea of something you might want to take a listen to over break. All right. So the last component of aggregate demand, remember we were talking, the third component of aggregate demand that we were talking about is investment demand. Remember that we were looking at the different components of aggregate demand. We said consumption and government spending. And the third component is investment demand. And investment demand is what? It's new physical capital. Investment is new capital, right? And what we mean by capital in the macroeconomic sense is things that are goods that are used to produce other goods and services. That is machinery, buildings, inventory is also included. And so machinery, buildings, and inventory are the main components of what we call investment demand. Now, if we're trying to increase the aggregate demand, remember that we said that what could happen is that real GDP you could be stuck at an equilibrium which was at less than full employment. How do you shift this investment demand, right? We talked about you could increase consumption demand by reducing taxes. You had this issue that if people save the money, you have this paradox of thrift that you need to, if you reduce taxes and they don't spend it, then it doesn't show up as consumption demand. We said government spending directly shows up as demand. So what about investment demand? And again, we're going to ignore exports minus imports because although each of them are moderately large, the difference was only $780 billion. And so we are, again, there are other classes that you can take to go into that in more detail. So the trick here is that the demand depends on the interest rate. The demand for these things, the demand for investment goods depends on the interest rate. And then we just need to think for a moment why that would be, and it has to do with opportunity cost. That is, what else could I do with the money? So suppose that I could buy a machine for $100, right? So I could buy a machine for $100. And let's say that machine's going to last for 10 years. It'll last for 10 years. And it depreciates over that time. So at the end of 10 years, it's worn out. That's what's called, depreciation. Right? That is that machine is wearing out, or that building is wearing out over time. You can see buildings around that have depreciated. Their value's been going down because they've been wearing out. And if you're not putting money into restoring it or whatever, or keeping it up, then it's gonna deteriorate. So let's say that it could earned, let's say, $5 in added value. a year, right? It could have earned $5 a year in added value. So what's the opportunity? What else could I do? Well, lots and lots of things that you could do with the money. In order for this, just to give you the idea how the Keynesian model works, we're just going to make a simple assumption. And the simple assumption is you could have bought a bond. And a bond is where you pay, let's say, a U.S. Treasury bond. If I could have bought a U.S. Treasury bond, I'd pay $1,000 for the bond or whatever. And then what do you do? Well, let's say in this particular instance, we made it $100. But U.S. Treasury bonds are in $1,000 increments. But let's say you could buy this bond for $100, and it pays 5% interest, right? Then what has to happen is, what's my alternative? If this machine doesn't produce the $15 per year, which would be, if the machine produced $15 per year, what would you get? You'd get the $5 that would match the interest, and you'd get the $10 per year in depreciation. But the point here is that I've got this alternative over here where if the interest rate is $5, this machine's got to earn at least $15. It's got to pay back its depreciation, which I could have done with the bond, and it's got to pay me enough to equal what I could have got with the interest rate on the bond. So if you think about that, then suppose the interest rate goes, suppose this machine does in fact produce that, okay? Suppose the interest rate goes to 10%, right? Suppose that bonds now pay 10% interest. Well, that machine isn't going to be useful any longer, right? That machine's going to have to produce $10 a year plus in terms of return, plus the $10 in depreciation. So the point here being that if the interest rate goes to 10%, this machine is not viable. So the point is that, you know, just even if you just ignore depreciation for right now, suppose the machine never wore out. If my alternative is a bond at 10% and my machine's only earning 5%, I'm not going to buy the machine. If the interest rate were 3%, then I'm going to buy the machine. So that if we were to then take a look at this, then we would have the demand for investment would be depending on the interest rate, right? So if we looked at the interest rate here and we looked at the demand for investment, it would look like that, right? It'd be like any other demand curve that we looked at. It's downward sloping. As the interest rate falls, then more machines are going to be able to meet the interest rate standard. And so lowering the interest rate will increase the demand, for machinery. And so if I can change the interest rate, then I'm going to have total demand move out to the right. If we go back to our aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? If we had aggregate demand was here, and we had aggregate supply that looked like that, and what am I trying to do? I'm trying to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right. If what I can do is I can increase the demand for government goods, I can shift to the right. If I can increase the demand for consumption goods, I shift to the right. But I can also shift it to the right by increasing the demand for investment goods. How do I do that? I lower the interest rate. Okay? Now, how do you lower the interest rates, right? How does the government do that? And it does that through monetary policy. And what the Federal Reserve was established in 1913. Remember, we talked about that when we were talking about how the West grew rich, the 16th Amendment, the 17th Amendment, and the Federal Reserve all happening in 1913. And so what monetary policy is that the Federal Reserve alters the money supply to affect interest rates. Okay, so they're going to the Federal Reserve will go out and try to affect the interest rate. So how do they do that? Well, first of all, they're going to alter the money supply. So we got to have an idea what money is. All right, so what do we mean by money? Money is the medium of exchange. Right? That's simply what money is, and it can depend on the place where you're at, the time that you're at, what may serve as money. And so there have been lots of things over time that have served as money. It's a medium of exchange. It says, okay, I remember that we said that barter doesn't work very well, right? When we were talking about the feudal period and barter. Well, what makes it so that you don't have to barter when you go to Market House to buy some potato chips, right? What happens is you swap your labor for a thing called money, right? And then you go, and it's this medium of exchange, in that you can take that money and then you go to Market House, and Market House will swap you the potato chips or whatever for the money that you gave them. So you don't have to barter. You trade your labor or you trade your services or whatever in order to get this thing that's the medium of exchange, and then you can use that to buy other goods and services with. And of course, there's lots of things that have served as money. Cattle, tobacco has served as money, gold, actually seashells in some places have served as money. But gold and silver have tended to outcompete what other entities are in terms of money, and we'll talk about that, why that might happen in a moment. But the idea is that you want money to facilitate trade and to store value. That's why you want money, right? So that I want to know, in terms of storing value, I want to know that I've now swapped you my labor services for this medium of exchange here that we're using. And I want to know that 2 months from now, when I go to the store to buy something with it, that it is of the same value as it was when I swapped my labor for it. If what happens is it loses its value, like in Venezuela, if it loses its value, then it's not going to serve very well as money. People are going to start searching for other things. And again, we can talk about why gold tends to work as a store of value. Even today, gold is used as a store of value. Even though you can't go to the grocery store and buy something with gold, you can buy gold and hope that you buy gold with your current medium of exchange. And the idea being that over time, if prices are going up, gold prices are going to go up. And so your gold is then acting as a store of value. 10 years from now, you swap that gold for money, which each dollar is worth less, but you got more dollars. You got more dollars for the gold. So again, that's one of the things to think about when we're looking at money. If we look at what are some characteristics that we'd want money to have, sort of think about it. And there are other characteristics that you might think of as well, just as when we were talking about what things shift the demand curve, you could think about other things as well. But what are some of the characteristics that you'd like money to have? Well, the first thing you think about is you want it to be portable, right? You want to be able to carry it around, right? Anvils wouldn't work very well, right? I can't carry the thing around. And a second thing is that it ought to be divisible. I should be able to buy a new car with it or buy a house with it, but I also should be able to buy a package of Oreo cookies with it, right? So, if we had a gold bar, you couldn't go into Kroger's and swap it for a package of Oreos, right? So it has to be divisible. It has to be durable. Right? It can't break. You can't have, if you had, a crystalline model of something, right? And you have the ice cream truck drives by, and you give it to your 6-year-old to go out and stop the ice cream truck and buy some ice cream, and he falls and drops the thing, and it crystal shatters all over the place, right? That's not going to work very well. You want whatever it is, you want to be that it's durable. And then a fourth thing is what's called assayable. And what does that mean? It means that you should tell if it's counterfeit. Right? You should be able to tell, okay, this is iron pyrite and this is gold. Or if you were to look at I don't have a $20 bill with me today because I spent the last one when my wife didn't give me any more money. But if you take a $20 bill and you hold it up, you'll see that there's a little mark in there so that you can tell that that's actually a real $20 bill. So there are the Federal Reserve notes, which we'll talk about in a moment, have characteristics to them to make sure that you can tell that it's not counterfeit. So whatever it is that you're using for money, you have to be able to tell that this is really what it is. This is like I have some mechanism to tell that this is silver rather than something else. Again, you can think of other things, but these types of characteristics are what gold and silver tend to have these. And so you can see why gold and silver tended to outcompete over time. Now, again, you can have gold and silver coin, right? We don't have gold bars. And, when I was growing up, quarters were actually made out of silver, and you could get silver dollars, right? If you ever heard of silver dollar, there's a silver dollar saloon in, someplace like Tombstone or whatever. The silver dollar was actually made out of silver. It had a certain amount of weight of silver in it. And so gold and silver coin would tend to have these things. You couldn't make lots and lots of silver. Again, if you sort of think about it, when gold was discovered in California, what did that do? That tended to make more gold and increase the supply of money relative to stuff. And so we saw price inflation out when you had the major discovery in gold, just as an aside. Now, what is money in the U.S. today? Today, money in the U.S. Is what's called currency in the hands of the public. That is quarters, dimes. This is a Federal Reserve note. This is a $1 note. It says Federal Reserve note across the top. If this money's sitting in a bank, that's not money. It's not called money in terms of the measurement of how much money's out there. But currency that's not being held in the bank, that's in your pocket, and basically checking accounts. Again, we're shortening things down quite a bit, just not in the super amount of detail that you'd have. This is called M1. There are also other measures of money, but we're going to use M1. And M1 today is currently about $5.58 trillion. This $5.58 trillion is what the size of M1 is. And if you go to the Federal Reserve, it has a statistical release that it puts out monthly. And the H6 is, if we go to the Federal Reserve, they put out a monthly bulletin, and H6, their table 1, that gives you the components of M1 and M2 and what's called the monetary base, But our concern here is just to give you an idea how the system works. So about 40% of M1 is currency. Currency in the hands of the public, that's about $2.04 trillion. So just to give you an idea, when we're talking about numbers, just to give you an idea how much how much money's out there. Again, you can go look up the Federal Reserve, go to their website and go to their tables, and you can find all sorts of breakdowns of the money supply. Now, how can the Federal Reserve then alter the money supply? Okay. How can it affect the supply of money? Well, there's two simple ways, or one simple way and one a little more complicated way. The simple way is that it can create these Federal Reserve notes. And it will buy U.S. Treasuries with it. That is, we noted that there was a large increase in the federal debt when we were talking about the period since 1913. And what the Federal Reserve can do is it can create these things here, these Federal Reserve notes, and it can then take these and go out and buy the debt of the U.S. government, U.S. Treasury, when it's running a deficit. It will issue Treasury bonds, and the Federal Reserve then can buy those, and then that creates an increase in the money supply, so that the U.S. Treasury now has dollars to go out and spend to build a bridge or to pay Social Security or whatever. How do checking accounts get here then? This is sort of the linkage between when the Federal Reserve tries to do something or does something and how it eventually is going to end up. Eventually, we're going to end up with an increase in investment demand because we're going to eventually increase, or we're going to eventually end up with a change in the interest rate. So, how does this work? Okay, the Federal Reserve has, and most banks are members of the Federal Reserve. And again, if you get on the Federal Reserve's website, it'll give you a nice description about how the Federal Reserve works in terms of the member banks and the 12 regional banks. Hey, it turns out that there are 12 regional banks. That's probably beyond what you need to know in order to follow what we're talking about in terms of Keynesian macroeconomics. But again, when you take Econ 203, you'll go into that into more detail. But basically, banks that are a member of the Federal Reserve, banks have to keep part of their deposits as a reserve. But it's a fraction. So that, and we'll work through this in a moment here, this fraction that banks have to keep affects what the total supply of money is out there, because that'll affect the total amount of checking accounts that are out there. Okay? So what we're really talking about here is that banks can create money. In particular, that portion of M1 is how can they do that? Checking accounts. Now, it used to be that banks actually had notes, and I have on the outside of my office, when you get back, you can look on the outside of my office. I actually have a note that Hillsdale County National Bank had. And that was serving as a medium of exchange, right? Because if people in Hillsdale were willing to accept it in a trade, then, if you could go into County National Bank they gave you a note, you could then go out and buy something with it. Let's say you borrowed 100 of these notes from County National Bank, and then you went out, and if the local grocery store would accept this as a medium of exchange, then even if it only worked within Hillsdale County or something, it still would work as a medium of exchange in Hillsdale County. But nonetheless, the point is that one mechanism is that the Fed could use Federal Reserve notes, but banks create money rather than issuing today. Banks don't create money by issuing their own notes, okay? But today, the way banks create money would be through checking accounts. And how does that work? So let's just give you an example. Suppose that suppose that the reserve requirement is 10%, okay? Which up until very recently, that's about what the Federal Reserve requirement was. So then what happens is you take $100 that you found it on the ground, or you got it from your paycheck, okay? So you take $100 and you put it in Hillsdale County National Bank, and what do? They give you a checking account, right, for $100. Now if we look at, let's say we have a little model here where we have the reserves, right? And we have the checking accounts of County National Bank. So it starts out, there's your checking account, okay? And Hillsdale County National Bank has $100 in reserves. But at a 10% reserve requirement, it only has to have of those, it's $10 in required reserves and then $90 in what we will call, or what is called, excess reserves. So now what happens is Sally comes in and Sally wants to borrow $90, wants to have a loan, okay? So this is going to be the assets as well, right? So this is the assets of the bank and this is the liabilities. Because it's a liability because if you come in and ask for your $100 back, they got to give you your $100, right? Turns out that with savings, anyway, with savings accounts, it turns out that's not quite true. You have to give them some time. But a demand, it's called checking accounts are called demand deposits. That is, they have to give you your money right back. Okay, so this is your checking account over here. Now what happens is Sally comes in and Sally gets a loan. So now what happens is they have the $100 in your checking account and they have $90 in Sally's, right? Sally has a $90 checking account now because the Hillsborough County National Bank granted her the loan. And so what do we still have? We have $100 in reserves and we got the $90 loan from Sally, okay? So their assets and liabilities match, right? Their liabilities are $190, but they've got this asset of the loan of $90 and they've got the $100 in reserves. But now the reserve requirement has changed, okay? Because what do we got over here? Now we have $191 in checking accounts out there. $90 for Sally's, $100 for yours. But, so what is our reserve requirement? Our reserve requirement is $19 in required reserves and $89 in excess reserves, okay? But now you can see what happens is Tom comes in and Tom wants a loan, right? So Tom wants a loan and you can give Tom an $89 loan. Okay, so Tom has an $89 loan. Well, now what happens is we've got your checking account of $100. We've got Sally's of $90. And now we've got Tom's of 81, not 89, okay? That adds up to 100, right? 19 and 81 add up to 100. So Sally's got one for $90, and now Tom's got one, has a checking account for $81. And what on this side now, they've got $100 in reserves. They've got the $90 loan from Sally, and they've got the $81 loan to Tom. So their assets and liabilities match up, 271. But notice that how much money's in checking accounts now? There's $271 in checking accounts. But we started out with just $100 in the Federal Reserve note that you walked into the bank with. So what's happened is the banks have now increased the supply of money because the system is fractional reserves. And if you go to the end, what are you going to end up with, right? If you go to the end, I would have what are my required reserves? With $100, what can 10% of 1,000, right? $100 is 10% of 1,000. So if they had no excess reserves, then if what happens is I put $100 into the reserves of banks, what can that do? That can result in $1,000 in checking accounts. But that's money, right? So M1 goes up by $1,000. So what we do then is that banks actually create money by only being a fractional reserve banking system. If you didn't have, if you had 100% reserve requirement, there'd be no expansion by the banks, right? All there would be is swapping of a Federal Reserve note held in, remember it's currency held in the hands of the public. That now becomes currency now stuck into the bank as a reserve. So that's not money, right? But now you've got $100 in the checking account. So all you've done is swapped the form of M1 from currency in the hands of the public to demand deposits or checking accounts. But because it's fractional reserve system, then you can expand the amount of checking accounts out there by multiple, depending on what the reserve requirement is. So we can think about, okay, what if I'm trying to change the amount of money out there, and how can I do that? If I want to increase the amount of money, and we'll talk about in a moment why that would be something that the Federal Reserve would want to do if it wanted to alter the demand for investment. But so let's think about how could the Federal Reserve affect the money supply. We'll call it M1. Or we'll just call it the money supply. How could the Federal Reserve affect the money supply? Well, one obvious thing is it could change the reserve requirement. Right? If it changed the reserve requirement to 20%, then what would happen is you'd only be able to produce $500 in demand deposits. Okay? And so normally the Federal Reserve doesn't change the interest rate, or excuse me, the reserve requirement very much, because if they were to increase the reserve requirement, the banks are going to have to call in some of these loans. The banks are going to have to call in some of these things in order to get the money to be able to increase their reserves. So it hasn't been used a lot in order to do that. A second policy tool is to banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve. The banks can borrow from the Fed, and why would you do that? Because you expected Sally to show up with her loan, and she didn't show up, okay? So now what's going on is you expected that to meet, when she pays her $100 or her $90 back, that would have helped you meet your reserve requirement or allowed you to meet your reserve requirement. But she doesn't show up to pay her loan back. So now you're short. So how can you meet your reserve requirement where you can borrow from the Fed, right? And it will charge interest. Now, while the Federal Reserve alters this interest rate, it usually does it because the market interest rate is changing. So that if the market interest rate went from 2% to 5%, that is, you could buy bonds, you could buy a General Motors bond for 5%, okay? And you can borrow from the Fed at 2%, well then that's what you're going to do, right? You'll borrow at 2%, you'll get 5% from the bond, and then pay the 2% back to the Federal Reserve. So in order to keep banks from doing that, they move the rate at which they can borrow from the Fed back and forth. And so although that moves around, it's not really used much as a policy tool to make it so that banks hold more in excess reserves rather than going out to right to the very edge. They hold 12% in reserves rather than the 10%. So theoretically it could work that way, but it's not the major policy tool that we might think it might be. The one that's most frequently used is what's called open market operations. This is the one that and this is what's called the Open Market Committee of the Fed. They meet and they decide what the interest rate ought to be. And what they do is the Open Market Committee then buys and sells bonds in order to make the interest rate move to where it might be, or where they want it to be. Now, if we sort of think about how that might be, is that and the Open Market Committee is made up of 7 of the members of the presidents of the board of the presidents of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, and so there's 7 of those, which always includes the head of the New York Fed, and then members of the rest are made up of members of the Open Market Committee, or are separate individuals. Now, if we think about how that might work, if the Fed were to buy a bond, when the Fed buys a bond, what does that do? That increases the reserves of banks. Because a bond is not a reserve of the bank. Okay, they have to have assets at the technically the assets are sitting at the Federal Reserve Bank, that is the regional Federal Reserve Bank for where the County National Bank is. Okay, so what happens is if the Federal Reserve buys a bond, it increases the reserves of banks, because now what happens is that the bank has, let's say it buys $1,000, right? So it buys a $1,000 bond. The bank now has $1,000 in reserves at the Fed. It's given up the bond, which was not a reserve. It was holding it as an asset, okay? It was earning interest on it or whatever. But what happens is that the Fed buys that bond from the bank, and if it buys the bond from the bank, then the bank now has more reserves. Well, if the bank has more reserves, so the bank has more reserves, then what can happen? Well, if we increase the amount of reserves, what does that do? Increases loans, increases checking accounts, increases the money supply, right? So the way the Federal Reserve operates then is that it buys and sells bonds. And so when the Fed buys a bond from the bank, it then increases the bank's reserves. That increases the amount of loans they can make. That increases the amount of checking accounts. And that increases then the supply of money. Now, how does the supply of money then affect the interest rate? Remember that I said that the investment demand depends on the interest rate. The lower the interest rate, the higher the amount of investment demand out there. The higher the interest rate, the less investment demand. So how is the supply of money in the Keynesian model related to the interest rate? So, and again, there are other models, macroeconomic models. We'll maybe have a chance to talk about the Austrian business cycle model. But the point here is that, again, if you are a policymaker, if you are President Obama during the Great Recession, or let's say you're President Biden and you're dealing with the coronavirus problem and the economy and a downturn or whatever, then what will happen is, if you're a Keynesian, we would expect you to undertake these policies. And so the purpose here is for you to recognize, this is how the Keynesian model works. I see why they're doing that. So in the Keynesian model, you have a demand for money and a supply of money. You have a demand for money and you have a supply of money. Now, we just said that the Federal Reserve can affect the supply of money, right? The Federal Reserve can affect the supply of money by changing the reserves of banks or just going out there and buying U.S. Treasury bonds. So if it was it creates the Federal Reserve note, buys a U.S. Treasury bond from the U.S. Treasury. So the U.S. Treasury now has money and it can go out and it can buy whatever it's buying on the demand side of the federal government. And we also then said that it could change the reserves of banks by either buying bonds from the banks or changing the reserve requirement, et cetera. So we noted how they can create the supply of money, or affect the supply of money. What's going on with this demand for money? Well, it's not a demand for wealth, right? Otherwise, there'd be an infinite demand or very large demand, right? Most people would like to have more wealth. But it's how much of your wealth you want to hold in money. Because let's say you have $1 million in wealth, okay? You could own a house that's worth $500,000. You could have bonds which are not worth money. You could have stock which is not money, right? You can't take 100 shares of Tesla and go buy something at Jilly Beans downtown with that, right? So the question is, given your wealth, how much of it do you want to hold in money, right? Basically in checking accounts or cash in your pocket, right? So how much wealth do you want to hold in your money? And what will that depend upon? Again, it'll depend on opportunity cost, right? And of course, again, we said lots of things that you can do with your wealth, but just to make the model simple, we'll say what's an alternative to holding your wealth in money that you can walk into the grocery store and buy something with, is that you could hold it in a bond, okay? So suppose bond is your alternative use, right? Well, if you sort of think about it then, is that how much would you want to hold in wealth? Suppose that the interest rate is 5%, okay? So that if you're holding $100 in your pocket that you could have earned 5% on, what's the opportunity cost? It's 5% of the $100. Suppose that the interest rate goes to 10%. Now what happens? Then your opportunity cost of holding money has just gone up, right? So what'll that say? Your demand for money will be less. And so if we look at what's going on here, is that if I were to draw a demand for money and I put the interest rate here, because that's really the price of holding money, right, is the opportunity cost, whatever you could be doing. So if in the very simple model, we'll have the interest rate. And then this is the quantity of money. What would happen is the demand for money would look like this, right? At zero interest rates, if you can't earn anything on a bond, why not hold cash in your pocket, right? Because of the convenience to holding money, right? So there's a convenience to holding money. And what we're going to do for the last lecture is that we will put the demand and supply of money together, and then we will look through and discuss how that then shifts the aggregate demand curve, and then we'll talk a little bit about what is the probability that the Federal Reserve could make this all come out right, or that the federal government could make this all come out right in terms of knowing what G is, et cetera. And we'll talk a little bit about what Mises and Hayek would have thought of this. So for next time, we will basically finish the macro part of 105.